opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, commerce in Europe largely collapsed for many centuries. An increase in agricultural production after about 1000 AD set the stage for a re-emergence of trading and commerce, but it turned out that the new merchants were going to need rules to govern their trading. How they managed to accomplish this is pretty remarkable, as they did not turn to any of the kings of Europe, but rather made and enforced the rules themselves. Today we think the government must be the source of law, but the medieval merchant law is one example, and really one of many examples, where people have been able to order their affairs without resorting to government. Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about his research on the merchant law is Dr. Bruce Benson, the Professor Emeritus of Economics at Florida State University. Dr. Benson earned his PhD in economics from Texas A&M, and while at FSU held the DeVoe Moore Professorship in Economics. He also served as department chair. His research over the years has spanned many different topics in the fields of law and economics and economic history, including questions like prison reform, drug prohibition, the construction of roads in medieval England, as well as the development of mercantile law that we're going to be talking about today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to Troy University, Bruce, and welcome you to EconVersations.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on the show. So, what we're going to be talking about today is business law, and we have business law in modern America and modern society today, and many free market economists and even proponents of very limited government would argue that the government needs to provide laws and courts to resolve disputes and allow people to trade and in other words engage in commerce for the free market economy to function. So if you could tell us a little bit about why it is that having rules like this is so important for trading and market activity to begin with.
Well, most exchanges that take place really have a time element to them. Mm-hmm. Even when you buy a quart of milk at the grocery store, there's an implicit guarantee that the milk isn't sour. Mm-hmm. And so if it's sour, you can go back and get another quart of milk. So there's an implicit guarantee that adds time to that simple exchange. Most major exchanges, especially at the wholesale level, involve lots of time. It may be that payments are to be made in the future, mm-hmm. or delivery takes place in the future, or there's a warranty or a guarantee that applies. And when time is involved, then people have to make promises. They promise each other that they're going to do whatever it is they have to do in the future. Why would they live up to those promises? What would motivate them to do so? If you get the good now and you're supposed to pay in the future, why pay for it? Mm-hmm. Without some rules, you may choose not to do that. In economics, we like to use words other people don't use very often, so we talk about credibility of promises. Mm-hmm. Why might a promise be credible? And I would suggest there's three reasons. One is knowledge. You just know what the product is, you can judge its quality, you just trust each other because of your knowledge. Mm-hmm. The second one, we don't know everything, of course, and so knowledge is not a big source of credibility in a lot of situations. The second one is trust. If we trust each other, we've dealt with each other repeatedly, and we just believe each other. That is a second option. You tend to believe people that you trust. Is that the only kinds of exchanges we can have? Well, there's a third option, and that's recourse.
Okay.
An outside third-party enforcement of some sort, for instance, like the government, where they have a court and they look at the agreement and they say whether you lived up to it or you didn't, or if you didn't, you have a good reason for not, and that sort of thing. And so with recourse, then, of course, you have to sort of understand what the rules of the game are, so that court can make a judgment even.
Right.
And so, since recourse, we don't trust everyone we deal with. We don't even know a lot of people we deal with. Recourse ends up being very important. Law then about trading, about commerce, is an important source of credibility, which allows tremendous numbers of exchanges to occur all over the world, and of course through exchange, everyone expects to be better off. Most of the time they are. So this is a good thing.
And the revival of trade that we saw in Europe really helped to start generating prosperity in Europe after the misery of the Dark Ages, right?
Yeah, of course, Rome fell, the Western Empire in 400 and some AD, and there was a period after that where we don't really know what was going on. There's not much in the way of recorded history or anything. There was certainly trade going on, but not in tremendous amounts. And of course, you had all sorts of things like Viking raids and the Muslim take over the Mediterranean, and all these sorts of things that disrupted everything. It was a very tumultuous time. So trade was not really active. Again, there was some trade, but not a lot. Around the 10th century into the 11th and 12th, you get a period of relative peace and tremendous amounts of goods that people really wanted were coming in from the Far East, spices, dyes, all sorts of things that were just amazing to Europeans at the time. And you get a development of cloth production, actually, was the big stimulus for commerce to emerge. The Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, what was called Flanders, started manufacturing in a very low-tech way cloth. And so you want everybody around the Mediterranean wants the cloth. The Mediterranean is where all the spices and things are flowing into. And so you develop trade relationships between this Northern European community of cloth producers and the Mediterranean community of traders. And so they don't know each other when they're starting out. They need to, it's amazing stuff. These were amazing people who would form a caravan to take it over the Alps and down into France and things like, or to take it across Asia and bring back spices.
Wow.
It was really a phenomenally interesting period for commerce to take place. But we also see the emergence of this system of rules about commerce, various kinds of contracts that that would be supported, partnerships, insurance develops. This is a time where, for the most part, state governments were very limited in what they did.
Right.
They didn't enforce law, except for the very elite. They didn't have courts for the common people. And so you couldn't turn to the state to provide these rules or enforce these rules. So merchants came up with ways to do it themselves.
So in your research, you talk about the two different sources that we can have for law. One is called customary law, which is what the merchant law came out of, and then authoritarian law. So I want to talk a little bit about these two different sources of law to begin with. So what do we sort of mean by this customary law? We've already hinted a little bit at it in terms of it sort of came from the merchants themselves. And is that like what we're meaning here?
Yeah, customary. One way of differentiating is bottom up or top down.
Yeah.
Bottom up rules develop as people voluntarily interact with one another and decide how to deal with various kinds of problems or contingencies that might arise. And so they develop methods, standard practices or standard contract clauses, things like that, where they all sort of share the same view about how you deal with certain things. And it's more of you might call them norms or something like that. I call them customary law because I want to think about that as opposed to the top-down law, which is I call authoritarian. I stole these ideas from anthropologists, but top-down law is law that's imposed from the top through typically the use of command or coercion, the power to back those laws. Bottom-up law doesn't have an executive to enforce rules. The rules develop essentially voluntarily, spontaneously.
Right. And there are other examples of this. I think previously on a show we've had shows on like some of the informal norms in sports, and then also the development of the common law, which would be two of the other cases of customary law. And now today, I mean, authoritarian law, as you said, like comes from the government, and really, in many ways, people today are maybe unaware of the idea of customary laws. And we think that the government has to be the only authoritarian top-down law has to be the only way that we get law, because Congress passes law and then the courts enforce them, and that seems to be what we're used to today, right?
Well, that's what we've been taught to think, at least. I think if we really sit back and look at our daily life and what we do all day long, interacting with other people, buying, selling, driving past each other on the road. These rules, some of them have been codified by the government, speed laws.
Right.
In fact, I would say about the only time I ever think about the government's laws is when I'm driving too fast and I'm afraid I might get a ticket. Everything else that I do really has nothing I recognize to be from the top in terms of laws. I deal with my family based on our norms, our beliefs. I deal with friends, I deal with colleagues at the university. All of these arrangements have rules, just like playing chess has rules. They're not imposed by the government. They've developed through interaction, and we just naturally follow them. So I think this bottom-up kind of idea is still extremely important to understand in terms of trying to understand how people live their day-to-day lives. But it's still vitally important when we think about trade as well. Even today, international trade, there's no state at the top to
Right.
enforce those rules. Yet there's tremendous amounts of international trade.
Now, to give a little bit of perspective, you already told us a little bit about what was going on in medieval Europe as trade was starting to reemerge, but I mean, a little bit about the nature of that trade can help us understand some of the specific problems that merchants faced. And one of the things was that merchants would often get together in what were called, I guess, merchant fairs at the time, right?
Yeah. The fairs, and this is a nice picture of a fair because you can just see all the people. People would come from all over Europe to some of these fairs, not just merchants, pilgrims, because a lot of the fairs were at church shrines and things like that. It'd be a huge celebration. That's what a fair is usually thought about. But for commerce, it was a place where merchants got together and traded their goods. So the merchants from Flanders would take their cloth down to the champagne fairs in France. The merchants from Italy would bring the spices and things like that up to those fairs. They would meet there and they would exchange.
Okay.
And they, of course, had the exchange was basically on credit. So you're going to have contracts, either implicit or explicit. And so someone would take his cloth and sell it to an Italian merchant with a promise that the merchant would pay for it at the end of the fair or at the next fair or something like that. You had to have this credibility of promises. The fairs would be in different political jurisdictions, so you wouldn't even have the same state law in the two places. So you need some other kind of mechanism, process for these people to accept these promises as legitimate because there was an enforcement mechanism, a dispute resolution mechanism. And the mechanism for dispute resolution, typically at the fair, there would be a fair court. There were lots of other courts at the time too. I mean, the church had courts and the state had courts and the towns had courts, and they could choose among these different courts. But the fair court wasn't even exclusively merchant court. Anything that arises at the fair, a fight between two people, could go to the fair court. But most of the business of the fair court was merchant disputes. So they chose from among themselves trusted, knowledgeable merchants to serve as judges, or in a sense as arbitrators, who would then listen to the evidence, make a decision about who was right and who was wrong, and order compensation payment or what or performance. They could order you to follow up and do what you promised to do, those sorts of things. The expectation was that you would do what the court said. Now, there was no executive branch to police that. There was no centralized power to make you accept the court's rulings, but there was a very powerful incentives mechanism.
And so it's really, this is from your research, and it's sort of from a broad picture trying to explain what it is that rules have to do. This is you're talking about how they have judges, and that's taking care of the third thing, or the second thing on the point here. But the first one was get people to agree, and so, you know, if a merchant got a judgment against them, why would they do what the judge told them to do?
Because they wanted to be a merchant. Essentially, the merchants had a very well-developed information spreading process. when they met and to trade, they talked about all sorts of things, about other people they traded with, about what the prices were in some other places, and things like that. And they developed, like, they had almost like a pony express from some of the Italian towns up to the Champagne fairs in France, where information could be sent. We're talking medieval period. There's no telegraph, there's no phones, but it could be sent relatively quickly. So they developed these information spreading mechanisms. And if someone cheated and refused to go to court, information went out that the guy couldn't be trusted. Before long, he wasn't a merchant anymore because no one wanted to trade with him. If he went to court and then refused to live up to the judgment, the same thing.
Same thing.
Word spread, he is out of business pretty fast. I mean, it might not, people might not always react to the word with total ostracism and say, I'm never going to deal with that guy. But when the next time they deal with him, they may only deal if they can get a lower price, or if there's some collateral, some sort of bond posted or something like that, because they want to guard against the risk of the person cheating again. Well, all that stuff adds to the cost of doing business for the cheater, and so if he's not ostracized, he probably is going to end up bankrupt anyway. So it was very much a social sanctioning process. Merchants built their reputations for honesty. They invested in those reputations, and they wanted to maintain those reputations because they were valuable, got them a lot more trade. If word spread that they were cheaters, it destroyed that reputation, and pretty quick they were out of business.
So we want to talk a little about this third point here about when we need to have the ability to come up with new rules or adopt or change, modify our existing rules as new circumstances arise. Because I mean, disputes could arise, and sometimes disputes could arise because you and I are trying to trade, and we're doing something that we haven't done before. It's a new product, a new kind of insurance or something like, and a dispute comes up, and we don't have rules for that. So how did they sort of like come up with the new rules?
Well, if we want to trade bad enough, we'll figure it out. Essentially, we'll devise a contract that takes into account these new situations, and then if that works, if it works well for this new situation, we may tell other people about it the next time we contract with somebody else, or or word spread. People observe what's going on and say, that's a good way to do this. And these words spread essentially through emulation. People saw what other people were doing, saw it worked, and adopted that behavioral rule. If you think about a contract, it's essentially setting up rules about how you're going to behave towards each other in the future. And so you could create new rules by writing new contracts. Now, that was probably the main way that this process worked in medieval commerce. Another way, of course, is the way the common law now works, is that a dispute arises, a judge comes up with a solution that implies a new rule.
Okay.
But there was no executive authority again, so other people didn't have to adopt that rule the way they do under common law today. But if it worked, again, if it looked like a good rule, they would accept it. And so you get the evolution of contracts getting more and more complex, dealing with more and more rules, and they spread. You get standard contract clauses that everybody's putting into their contracts, or it becomes understood. A lot of these things were never written down, really.
Right.
It's just a practice that everybody expects others to follow.
Which is if probably for a modern scholar or somebody educated today to go back and look at it, it seems very weird, because we're used to thinking, in the whole profession of law is like, okay, you can figure out what the law is because it's written down and it's written in language, and you can read it and figure out what it is. These rules weren't written down, but
Yeah.
at the same time, there are a lot other cases in life where we see that there are rules that aren't written down. Like as a baseball fan, like you'll sometimes hear managers are managing by the book, and nobody's ever seen that book.
Yeah.
All right, there are these rules, or you can work for a business. The employee handbook tells you what you're in some sense supposed to do, but then the other employees will tell you how you really get things done.
Yeah. That sort of process is, in a sense, invisible to other people. They don't really know what's going on. But so how you know whether they have rules or not is to look at their behavior. Are they behaving in a certain way that's implies that there's an underlying rule like that? Now, they did write down these rules on occasion as well. There were documents where some individual cleric or something would write down a list of rules about trade. It's probably very incomplete, but it's really knowing the game,
Right.
Knowing what practices are, customs are, interpretations or usage, and everybody sort of being on the same page, and that's how they work. It doesn't end up being a written law. Of course, you ever try to read a statute, you know what it says when you're done.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Is that
Writing
the other
things
way of
down doesn't necessarily clarify things.
And when you talk about the effect of rules, I mean, a big part of it is to affect how people are behaving or their expectations. Like I'm willing to trade with you because I can expect that you're going to behave in a certain way, and the same thing for you. Or if you have expectations about me, and that's a big part of what these rules are accomplishing, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like the medieval merchant law might be very dusty, thing of history, but there are some practices in commercial law today. You mentioned one, that international trade, where it's not being bound by the laws of any one nation. Mm-hmm. But in other cases, arbitration that actually looks remarkably similar. I remember reading your work on the merchant law. It is sort of remarkably similar to something in our lives today, and that's arbitration, right?
Interestingly, in the merchant law, contract dominated. So if two individuals contracted to do something different than what the standard rules were, they had the right to do that. They could contract around a rule they didn't like, but only it applies to themselves.
Right.
In a way, and arbitration is similarly a way that you can do that today. You can write a contract with somebody and put an arbitration clause in it that says, if we disagree about some interpretation of this contract, we will go to a private arbitrator. You might pick the person ahead of time, or you might say, we're going to go to the American Arbitration Association and use one of their specialists in commercial arbitration, or any number of sources of arbitration. There's a lot more arbitration than there are court cases today.
Well, that's really fascinating. I think this whole conversation is very fascinating. Bruce, thanks for coming on, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.